She stood alone upon the gravel drive of Ashenmore Hall, with the wind off the Derbyshire moors, tugging at the hem of her soft, sage-green muslin. 20 years old, scarcely 5'3", with long, rich auburn chestnut hair gathered in a plain low knot beneath her straw poke bonnet, and 2 stray curls whipping at her temples, Miss Beatrice Ashcombe held in one cream-mittened hand a folded square of parchment that had been signed and sealed and delivered unto her like a death warrant. It was a marriage contract. Her brother had used her to pay his debts. Behind her, a single trunk. Before her, the dark Jacobean mass of a great house 3 centuries old, its chimneys smoking, its ivy black against the grey stone. Inside that house waited the man they called the Black Lion, the scarred recluse of the Peak District, the war-mad duke whose first wife, rumour swore, had died of terror of him. In a few minutes, she would stand before him. In a few minutes she would look up into his face, and she would see, in the firelight, the one thing no living creature had thought to see in him for 12 years. Stay until the end. Hit that like button, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. But to understand how she came to stand upon that gravel, and how a gently bred young woman from a modest Warwickshire manor house came to hold in her gloved hand a contract that had sold her like a brood mare to the most feared man in the north of England, one must first go back 3 weeks to a damp April evening at Ashcombe Priory. The Priory was not a great house. It had been old when the Tudors fell, and neither Tudor nor Stuart had troubled to improve it. Its mullioned windows rattled in every wind, its chimneys smoked in the wrong weather. The kitchen gardens, once the pride of Mrs. Ashcombe's summer mornings, had gone to nettle and chickweed these 9 years since her death. Beatrice had been 11 when the carriage accident at Banbury took both her parents in a single afternoon, and she had been the mistress of the house in every sense that mattered, from the day of the funeral onward. Her brother, Mr. Cedric Ashcombe, had not troubled himself with mastering anything. At 24, he stood 5'10" with carefully arranged wavy chestnut-brown hair, oiled in the Byronic manner, pale blue-grey eyes, sunk in dark circles, a pasty fair complexion, and a handsome but dissipated face, spoiled by a petulant, soft mouth. He was slender, and he affected the dress of a man far better born and far richer, a plum-coloured tailcoat with mother-of-pearl buttons, a primrose yellow waistcoat embroidered with floral sprigs, an over-tied muslin cravat pierced with an amethyst pin, fawn pantaloons, and tasselled dress boots in which he had never once ridden a horse hard. He spent 9 months of the year in London and 3 at Crockford's, and what he did not lose at the hazard table he lost at whist, and what he did not lose at whist he lost on the horses at Newmarket. He had been losing, steadily, for 3 years. Their mother's small, separate estate, some £400 a year, left in the old lady's will to Beatrice and intended as a dowry, was Cedric's, to draw upon until his sister married. He had drawn upon it. He had drawn upon everything. The family plate, which had been pawned twice and redeemed once, was now in the keeping of a moneylender in Cheapside, against a note that came due at Michaelmas. The tenants' rents, when they came, vanished within the week into the pocket of some tradesman or other at the door. The butcher in the village no longer sent up a Sunday joint without payment in advance. It was Beatrice who kept the household running on eggs from the 2 remaining hens, on vegetables from the corner of the garden she still kept turned, and on the quiet forbearance of Mrs. Dunnage the cook, who had loved the late Mrs. Ashcombe and would not see her children starve. Her sister, her great care, the small bright point by which Beatrice steered every hour of her life, was Miss Clara Ashcombe, 12 years old this past February. Clara had long, rich, auburn curls, loose down her back with a cream ribbon tying back a single lock, wide hazel-green eyes like Beatrice's own, creamy pale skin, abundantly freckled across her small lively face, and the slight, narrow build of a child who had never known a winter entirely free of chilblains. She wore a plain, high-waisted, white muslin day dress with a faded blue sash, white stockings that had been darned at the heels more times than Beatrice could count, and black leather child's slippers that pinched at the toe. She was clever. She read Latin at the level of a boy of 15 because Beatrice had taught her. She believed, because Beatrice had contrived never to let her think otherwise, that their household was poorer than it had been, but not truly poor. Beatrice herself had not believed anything of the kind for a great while. That April evening, a Wednesday, she was at the scrubbed deal table in the still room, filling a stone jar with last autumn's preserved damsons, when she heard the gig in the lane. It was an hour past its expected time. She set down her ladle and wiped her hands upon her apron and listened. A loud, unsteady step upon the gravel, a laugh, too loud for the hour, a horse being led away to a stable by nobody in particular. Cedric had returned from London. He came through the hall door with his hat in his hand and his cravat already disordered, and a smell of port upon him so thick it travelled ahead of him down the passage. He came into the small parlour where Beatrice was now standing with her hands clasped before her, and he flung himself down upon the horsehair sofa, and he laughed. "You may congratulate me, sister," he said. "May I?" she said. "You may. I am come home a free man, every debt settled, every creditor paid. Crockford's, the Hebrew in Cheapside, Samuel at the livery, all settled, all signed off, all off my back at one blow." She looked at him. His eyes were glassy. His colour was bad. A man on the point of bankruptcy does not, as a rule, come home laughing. "And how, pray," she said, "have you worked this miracle?" "I have sold something," he said. He smiled. It was a sick, triumphant smile. "I have sold the only thing in this house that was worth anything, which is to say, you, my dear." For a long moment, Beatrice did not move. The fire in the grate popped softly. A candle guttered and steadied. Somewhere above their heads, Clara was singing to herself, faintly, a little scrap of a ballad she had been taught by Mrs. Dunnage. "Explain yourself, Cedric," she said. Her voice was very quiet. He sat up. He drew from the breast of his plum-coloured coat a folded paper, and he laid it upon the low table between them with a flourish. "A contract of marriage," he said, "drawn up by a respectable attorney in Lincoln's Inn, and signed this morning at 10:30. The suitor is the Duke of Ashenmore. You will have heard of him. All England has. The scarred recluse of the Peak, the Black Lion of Salamanca, half mad, half monster, so they say in the clubs, whose first wife died of terror of him in a Spanish fever. He has need of a wife. He has need of one, my dear, because the Crown will not permit him to resettle the Derbyshire lead mines in his own name, unless there is a lawful heir of his body to resettle them upon, and he has had 7 years to find such a wife, and has not contrived to find one that will have him. He is therefore elected to buy one. Cedric. He has paid £8,000 down, Beatrice. 8,000. In Bank of England notes. And he will assume every debt of this household. Every note, every bond, every reckoning at every tradesman's from here to Cheapside. Every one. In exchange for your hand in marriage, and whatever may come after. She felt the blood go out of her face. She pressed her mittened fingertips to the edge of the table to steady herself. "You have signed this," she said. "I have signed it. This morning. Without consulting me. I am your guardian, Beatrice. I am not obliged to consult you, and there is nothing to consult upon. The thing is done." She went out of the parlour. She went down the flagged passage to the kitchen, where Mrs. Dunnage was plucking a fowl by the fire, and she stood in the doorway and said, very evenly, "Mrs. Dunnage, what have you heard these 7 years of the Duke of Ashenmore?" Mrs. Dunnage set down the fowl. She wiped her hands upon her apron. She looked up at Beatrice, and her good round country face was suddenly white beneath its freckles. "Miss Beatrice," she said, "whatever do you ask for? Tell me what you have heard. Miss, tell me." Mrs. Dunnage crossed herself, which she had not done in Beatrice's hearing since the day the news had come from Banbury. "They do say," she said, "that he come back from the peninsula a changed man, miss, that the sabre took the left side of his face clean away, from brow to jaw, and they stitched him together in a Spanish barn by candlelight, and what came back to England was not what had gone out. They do say he took a wife out there, a black-haired Spanish lady, and she died within the 12-month, miss, of no fever that any doctor could name, only of terror of him, they say, of being alone with him in the night. They do say the housekeeper up at the Great Hall rules the whole house with a rod of iron because there is not another living creature in Derbyshire with the courage to stay in his service. He rides out alone, miss, over the moor, at all hours, in all weathers, and he speaks to nobody, and the country folk step off the road when they see him coming. He has not been seen in London society these 12 years. They call him the Black Lion, and they do not mean it kindly, miss. They do not mean it kindly at all." Beatrice stood in the doorway a long moment. She felt the stone flags cold through the thin soles of her slippers. She felt a small, tight pulse beating in her throat, just beneath the silver cross her mother had left her. "Thank you, Mrs. Dunnage," she said. She went back to the parlour. Cedric had poured himself a glass of the second-best brandy, which was the last spirits left in the house, and was sipping it with the complacent air of a man who has finished a difficult piece of business. "I have one condition," she said. "You are in no position to make conditions, my dear. I am in every position to make them. You have signed a contract for my hand. I have not yet signed it. Until I sign it, I am a woman of 20 with my wits about me, and you will hear me out. Or I will walk to the village tonight, and I will sit upon the steps of the Reverend Mr. Peel's house until morning, and I will tell him precisely what you have done." He looked at her. Something in her voice, something in the quiet, cold level of it, something he had not heard from her in the 9 years she had been keeping his house and hiding his disgrace from their sister, made his mouth close. "Well," he said at last, "name it." "Clara?" she said. "What of Clara?" "Clara cannot be left in this house with you. She is 12 years old. You have 3 years before she is marriageable, and meanwhile you have not the means to clothe her, or school her, or keep her from the bailiff. You will add to this contract, tonight, in your own hand, a separate clause guaranteeing that Clara Ashcombe shall have a home at Ashenmore Hall from the day of my marriage, and an allowance of not less than £100 per annum for her clothing and her schooling, to be paid quarterly and in her own name. And that clause shall be signed separately by the Duke's steward as well as by the Duke himself. It shall not be a promise upon your part, it shall be a covenant upon his. You cannot. I can, and I will, or I do not sign. And if I do not sign, your £8,000 are returned, and your creditors are at this door by Monday. And you are in the King's Bench by the end of the month. Write the clause, Cedric." He cursed her. He called her a name that she did not permit herself to hear. He snatched up the quill, and he dipped it in the standish with a hand that shook, and he wrote. She stood over his shoulder, and she read each word as it dried. When he had finished, she took the paper from beneath his hand, and she folded it, and she placed it in the pocket of her apron. "Send it to the Duke's attorney tomorrow by the early post," she said. "I will sign when it comes back countersigned by his steward, not before." She went upstairs. She did not go to Clara. She went to her own small chamber at the end of the passage, and she closed the door, and she sat upon the edge of her narrow bed, and for the space of perhaps 3 minutes she permitted herself to tremble. Then she dried her face upon the back of her wrist, and she rose, and she drew from beneath the bed the single small trunk of seasoned oak that had been her mother's, and she began, carefully and methodically, to pack. 3 gowns, the sage-green muslin for travelling, a plain grey stuff for mornings, and the one good evening gown of soft cream-figured lawn that had been her mother's and had been altered twice, her mother's shawl, 2 pairs of stockings, darned, her Bible, the fly-leaf inscribed in her father's hand on the day of her confirmation, her copy of Mrs. Barbauld's hymns, a small quill case and a stopped bottle of ink, a packet of letters from Clara, written over the years when Beatrice had gone to the village, or to the market, or sat up one long week with the vicar's wife in the scarlet fever, tied with a piece of faded blue ribbon, the miniature of Clara that she pinned inside her bodice upon a fine gold chain, and at the bottom, wrapped carefully in tissue, a single flat silver cross on a black silk cord that had been her mother's, which she took up and fastened at once about her own throat and did not afterwards remove. She did not cry as she packed. She had not cried, in truth, for 9 years. The habit of it had gone out of her with the carriage that had come back from Banbury empty. She worked steadily by the light of a single tallow candle, and she folded each garment twice, as her mother had taught her, and she said nothing at all aloud. The countersigned papers were returned from the Duke's attorney within 10 days. The Duke's steward, a Mr. Giles Barrow, whose hand upon the page was square and plain and without flourish, had signed the clause concerning Clara in a firm black ink, and the Duke himself had written beneath the signature in a hand, narrow and steep and soldierly, the single added phrase, "Guaranteed upon my honour and the honour of Ashenmore. A. Drayton." Beatrice read that line 3 times. Then she signed her own name beneath his. The chaise came for her at dawn, 3 weeks to the day, from the night Cedric had come home laughing. It was a plain travelling chaise, dark green, with no crest upon the door, a sober, serviceable carriage of the kind a country gentleman might send for a governess. The pair of bays stood patient in the grey damp Warwickshire dawn, their breath smoking upon the cold air, their hoofs dark upon the wet gravel. The driver touched his hat, a quiet, grizzled man, Mr. Barrow himself, Beatrice would learn later, though she did not then know it, swung down and set her trunk upon the rack, and strapped it tight, and stepped back. Clara had come down the stairs in her nightgown, with her shawl about her shoulders and her bare feet in her slippers, because no one had had the heart to send her up again. Mrs. Dunnage stood a little behind her in the hall, with red eyes, holding a handkerchief. Cedric did not come down at all. Clara flung her arms about Beatrice's neck. She did not weep loudly. She had learnt, as Beatrice had learnt before her, that a certain kind of weeping was not permitted in that house. But her small hot face was wet against Beatrice's throat, and her fingers knotted in Beatrice's pelisse, as though they would not be parted by any mortal force. "Write to me," Clara said. "Every week," Beatrice said. "On Sunday, without fail. You promise." "I promise, darling. And you will send for me. When it is time, I will send for you. Before the leaves turn, God willing." She kissed the top of Clara's head. She kissed it twice. She smelt the clean child's smell of her sister's hair, soap and warm bedclothes, and a faint ghost of the lavender Beatrice herself pressed into the linen chest, and she closed her eyes, only for a moment. Then she put Clara gently from her, and she nodded to Mrs. Dunnage, and she went out into the dawn. Mr. Barrow handed her up. The door was closed. The step was folded. The driver gathered his reins, and the bays moved off at a walk down the avenue of limes. Beatrice did not look back at the Priory. She had resolved, somewhere in the small hours of that morning, that she would not. She sat very upright in her corner of the chaise, with her hands folded in her lap upon the folded contract and upon the packet of Clara's letters, and she fixed her eyes upon the dark green lining of the seat opposite, and she did not turn her head. Only once, as the chaise came abreast of the east gable of the house, she turned in spite of herself, and she looked up at the small, square, leaded window of Clara's bedroom beneath the eaves. Clara's face was pressed against the glass. The child had run back up the stairs in her nightgown and slippers, to be there when the chaise went by. Her small palms were flat upon the pane on either side of her cheek. Her breath misted the glass. Her hazel-green eyes, so like Beatrice's own, were wide and unblinking, and altogether without tears, because Clara, like her sister, had been schooled in the older and harder discipline of love. Beatrice raised her gloved hand. She pressed her own palm to the window of the chaise, flat against the cold, wet glass upon her side. She held it there, fingers spread, as long as she could. The chaise rolled on. The east gable passed. The lime avenue cut the view. The small square window and the small pressed face were gone, and Miss Beatrice Ashcombe was driven away from the only home she had ever known, towards a scarred man she had never seen, with a folded contract upon her lap, and £8,000 of her brother's ransom in her name, and the damp Warwickshire dawn breaking slowly grey and gold over the hedges on either side of the Derbyshire road. The chaise rolled north through a cold grey April, and for the first hours Beatrice saw very little of the country through which she passed. She sat with her cheek against the window-glass and her gloved hands folded in her lap, and though the hedges went by in their budding green, and the lambs stood huddled against their mothers in the wet fields, she saw only the small square of nursery glass at Ashcombe Priory, and the small pale face pressed against it, and the one thin hand lifted in a farewell her little sister had not known how to make. By noon, the flat Warwickshire country had given over to the rising sheep-walks of Staffordshire, and by evening the chaise had turned up into the beginnings of a harder land. She slept that night at a clean small inn called the Greyhound, in a market town whose name she did not afterwards remember. The landlady was a stout, kind woman who asked no question at all. She gave her a private parlour and a dish of mutton broth and a bedroom over the stable-yard, where the horses stamped all night beneath the window. Beatrice laid her mother's silver cross upon the bolster and slept with her hand curled about it. The second day the country changed. Stone walls replaced the hawthorn hedges. Rough grey walls laid dry, without mortar, running straight up the shoulders of the hills and away. The villages were of stone also, low and thick-roofed, their chimneys smoking against a paler sky. Such trees as there were leaned all one way, set permanently sideways by a wind that came down from the high ground and did not stop. Beatrice saw her first limestone cliff at about 3 in the afternoon, a great white scar cut across a green hillside, showing the bone of the country beneath, and she drew in a small breath at the sight of it, and at the jackdaws circling above it in the April air. That night she stopped at a place called the Packhorse, which stood at a crossroads under a single ancient hawthorn that had been bent by the wind into the shape of a woman running. The landlord here was brisker and less kind, and the bedroom he gave her was small and smelt of damp. She washed her face in cold water from a white china ewer cracked across the rim. She ate a little bread and cheese. She had promised Clara she would write, and meant to keep the promise, but had not yet the heart of it. She did not know how to say to a child that the road was long, and that her sister did not know what lay at the end of it. The third day was the longest. The moorland opened out on either hand, vast, brown, still wintry with heather not yet come into bloom, and the wind came down off the tops with a thin, continuous singing in the gorse. She saw kestrels hanging in the air, and a hare running flat along a wall, and a shepherd motionless on a rise with 2 black dogs at his feet. The country was wilder than she had known country could be. She thought, it is possible that a man grown up in such a country is not like other men. It was towards dusk, with the light gone red-gold on the limestone, that the chaise came at last over the brow of a long moor and began its descent into a narrow green valley. A trout stream ran at the bottom of it, bright as a ribbon of tin in the dying sun. Above the stream, set upon a shelf of meadowland, a great house rose out of the rock of its own foundations as if it had grown there. Ashenmore Hall, Jacobean, grey, 2 centuries weathered, its windows small and many, and catching the last of the light, ivy climbing the south tower in a dark, thick mantle, every one of its chimneys smoking a thin blue line straight up into the windless evening. The horses blew. Beatrice sat very still. She had not known, until this moment, that she had been hoping for something small. The great iron-studded door stood open against a lit hall. A woman came out of that light, and down the 3 shallow steps to meet the chaise. When Beatrice had descended upon her stiff legs, she found herself looking up into a face she understood at once was to be reckoned with. Mrs. Harriet Finch was 55, upright and thin, with iron-grey hair drawn severely back beneath a crisp white cap. Her eyes were dark brown and shrewd. Her pale, weathered face bore deep laugh lines she plainly refused to smile enough to show. She wore a plain black bombazine gown with a starched white collar and cuffs, a white cotton apron, a great ring of keys at her waist, and sensible black leather shoes. She inclined her head exactly an inch, and said, in a voice as dry and clean as linen put by in lavender, "Miss Ashcombe, you are expected. I am Mrs. Finch. Be so good as to come within." "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. His Grace is not at home this evening. He left word that you were to be made comfortable and not disturbed until you had rested. Your rooms are prepared. This way, if you please." The hall was flagged with great slabs of limestone, worn hollow at the centre from 200 years of feet. Beeswax and wood smoke hung in the air. A wide oak staircase rose darkly at the far end beneath a stained glass panel that showed the Ashenmore lion in ruby and gold. A pair of silent footmen carried Beatrice's trunk up before her. Mrs. Finch walked ahead, her keys faintly jingling, her back so straight it seemed to have been made to a carpenter's rule. She did not speak again until they had passed along a panelled corridor in the east wing and stopped at a pair of white-painted doors. "Your sitting-room, Miss Ashcombe," she said, and opened them. Beatrice stepped inside and stopped. She had steeled herself for every kind of indignity. She had not prepared herself for kindness. A fire burned briskly in a white marble chimney-piece. The walls had been newly hung with pale yellow silk, of a shade so soft it looked like very thin sunshine, and there were fresh candles in every sconce, and a small posy of wild primroses in a cut-glass vase upon the writing-table. Beyond the sitting-room, a bedchamber opened, the bed turned down with lavender-scented linen, a hip bath drawn and steaming gently on the hearth. A quiet little maid stood by it, with hands clasped and eyes lowered. A girl of perhaps 16, in a neat print gown and a white cap, with a round country face and a nervous, ready blush. "This is Hetty," said Mrs. Finch. "She will attend you. She is a good girl, and she does not chatter. If there is anything wanting, ring. Supper will be brought at 8. She inclined her head, the same exact inch as before. "I bid you good evening, Miss Ashcombe. Welcome to Ashenmore." And she was gone before Beatrice had well thought how to answer her. Hetty gave a small, careful curtsy. "Please, miss, shall I help you from your pelisse?" "Yes," Beatrice said. "Thank you, Hetty." The hot bath that night was the first real kindness her body had had in weeks. Hetty brushed out the long, heavy auburn chestnut of Beatrice's hair before the fire and asked only, shyly, whether the water was warm enough. Beatrice took supper at the little round table by the window and ate more than she had thought she could. Afterwards she sat a long while at the fire in her wrapper, listening to the thin singing of the wind around the south tower, thinking of Clara with an ache she did not let herself give way to. She wrote a short letter. "Dearest Clara, I am arrived safely. The house is large and the country is wild but beautiful. The servants are kind, your own bay," and went to bed. She did not see the Duke that night, nor did she see him the next day, nor the day after, nor the day after that. He rode out at dawn. She heard from her pillow the sound of shod hooves ringing upon the cobbles of the stable-yard before ever the house stirred. And he came back, Hetty whispered, long after dark. He took his supper in the library alone. He had left word that Miss Ashcombe was to have the freedom of the house and the gardens, and that any book in the library was hers for as long as she wished. Beatrice walked in the kitchen garden in the April sun. She stood on the small stone bridge above the trout stream, watching the brown water hurry over the pebbles. She read a little Cowper. She wrote to Clara again. Slowly the silence began to seem like a kindness. He was giving her, she understood, time to find her feet before she had to stand upon them in his presence. On the morning of the 4th day, a note was brought to her on a silver salver, sealed with a plain black wafer. The hand upon it was small, square, soldierly. "Miss Ashcombe," it said, "if you are recovered from your journey, I should be obliged if you would take your tea with me in the library this evening at 8 o'clock. Ashenmore." She sent back her acceptance upon a card. She dressed with care that evening. She put on her other muslin, a plain one of soft ivory, and Hetty pinned her hair up in a low knot with 2 tortoiseshell pins and let 1 or 2 soft curls escape at her temples. She put on her mother's silver cross outside her collar for courage. At 7:45 she left her rooms. The long gallery ran the whole south front of the house. Its windows were tall and narrow. Full night had come down over the moor, and each pane gave back only the shaking reflection of the candles in the opposite sconces. A double row of Drayton ancestors looked down from the panelling, Elizabethan men in ruffs, Caroline women in pearls, and at the far end a life-sized painting of a young officer of perhaps 25 in scarlet regimentals, with jet-black hair and emerald eyes, and no scar at all upon his face. Beatrice paused only an instant before that portrait, and walked on. At the end of the gallery, a footman in plain dark livery bowed and stepped aside. "Miss Ashcombe, Your Grace," he said into the room, and withdrew. The library was a great high room lined to the ceiling with leather-bound books, calf and morocco, gilt-lettered, and there was a roaring fire of seasoned beech upon the hearth, and a branch of wax candles upon the table, and the smell of beeswax and good paper and wood smoke mingled in the warm air. A man stood with his back to the fire, so that for the first instant she saw only his silhouette, tall, broader than she had prepared herself for, very still. Then he turned. He was 36, tall, 4 inches over 6 feet, and built for it with the lean-waisted, powerful-shouldered frame of a man who had lived hard in the saddle for 7 years. His hair was thick and jet-black and worn a shade longer than fashion, wavy, prematurely silvered at both temples where the firelight caught it. His eyes beneath heavy black brows were deeply set and dark emerald green. His skin was warm bronze, weathered by peninsular suns. He had a strong, angular jaw, faintly dark with beard, a straight Roman nose, high cheekbones, a firm, grave mouth. He wore a charcoal grey, superfine wool tailcoat of severe military cut, with plain black horn buttons, a high black silk cravat tied in a simple knot, a black brocade waistcoat, close-fitted charcoal trousers of the new cut, polished black Hessian boots. Upon his left hand, a heavy gold signet ring bore the Ashenmore lion. Upon the smallest finger of his right hand, he wore a plain silver band, and from his left temple, running down across his cheekbone and finishing at the hinge of his jaw, there ran a long, pale, diagonal scar. Old, neatly healed, straight as a sword cut should be. The firelight lay along it and made it silver. He watched her face. Beatrice understood, in the same moment that she saw the scar, that he was watching her for what he had watched on every face for 12 years, and that he expected to find it there. She did not flinch. She crossed the long carpet toward him with her head up, and when she had come within the 3 paces that propriety allowed, she sank into a full, low curtsy, rose, met his eyes, and said in a clear, steady voice, "Your Grace, I am Beatrice Ashcombe. I believe you have bought me." The silence that followed was a long one. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the hour and was still. The fire snapped once upon the hearth. The Duke did not speak at first, but something moved behind the green of his eyes, a small, quick flicker, as a deep water changes colour when a cloud passes above it, and the firm, grave line of his mouth, altered by a degree she could not have named. Then he bowed. It was a soldier's bow, not a courtier's. He inclined from the waist, sharp and stiff, and he was stiff, she saw, in the right knee. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, and his voice was low and even and unornamented, a soldier's voice also. "I have not bought you. I have paid your brother's creditors, which is a thing he could not manage alone. If you wish to go home in the morning, you may go home in the morning, and the creditors remain paid. Sit down, please. I believe we have a great deal to say to one another." He indicated a small wing chair drawn up at the corner of the fire. She sat. He took the chair opposite, not too near. A small walnut table stood between them, bearing a silver pot of tea and 2 cups of thin white china. He poured for her himself. His hand was steady. She took the cup and saucer from him and set them on her knee, and did not drink. "Your brother," he said, "wrote to me in February. He was in a condition you will understand without my describing. I had been looking, for reasons I shall explain if you will hear them, for a wife. Not a girl out of a drawing room, a woman of sense. My solicitor answered him. The contract was drawn." "I have read it, Your Grace," Beatrice said. "My brother read it to me aloud. I wrote one of its clauses myself. Your sister's. My sister's. Miss Clara is to have a home at Ashenmore whenever you send for her, for as long as she wishes. Her schooling and her clothing are charged upon my estate separately from yourself, which means, Miss Ashcombe, that if you and I should part tomorrow, her settlement stands untouched. Mr. Barrow, my steward, countersigned it. I do not require further surety," she said. He inclined his head. "Then permit me to put to you certain other matters your brother did not trouble to explain. I have been married before. My first wife—" He paused, his eyes going for an instant past her shoulder to the dark window and back. "Did not live long. There is no child. The crown requires of Ashenmore an heir. That is the short of my necessity. I am not, Miss Ashcombe, an easy man." "No, Your Grace," Beatrice said. "I had been told that." The small flicker came again behind the green of his eyes. "What has been said of me in Warwickshire, I can imagine." "It is not, perhaps, what I shall now say of you," she said, before she had quite thought. And he looked at her very straight for a long second and did not answer that and went on. "I ask of you 3 things. That you consent to be my wife-in-law. That you consent to give this house an heir, if God so wills and when you are ready, not before. And that you consent, in the meantime, to live here as mistress of it, with every honour of the rank and no demand upon your person you have not yourself offered. I shall not come to your rooms, Miss Ashcombe. Your bedchamber has its own lock, and you keep the key. I have instructed Mrs. Finch accordingly." Beatrice felt the heat come up into her face, and sit there, and not go. She set her teacup down upon the walnut table very carefully, to give her hands something to do. "And there is a further thing. The wedding shall not stand until 6 months have run from this night. I mean it to be a true engagement, not a purchase. If at any time within those months you find you cannot bear it, me, the house, the country, any of it, you shall go, and I shall see it put about in London that the fault was mine. No shadow shall fall upon your name. Your sister's settlement shall stand. The creditors shall remain paid. You shall not be the worse for an hour of this. Do you understand me?" She looked at him, at the firm grave mouth, and the shadowed green eyes, and the long pale scar lit to silver by the fire, and understood that this was a speech he had written in his head upon the moor that morning, and had not known, until he heard himself saying it to her, whether he would be able to say it at all. "I understand you, Your Grace," she said. "Then you have 6 months, Miss Ashcombe," he said, "and no shorter." They spoke after that for nearly an hour, of the household, of Mrs. Finch, who, he said with a small twist at the corner of his mouth, was a better mistress of the Hall than he was a master, and would forgive Beatrice almost anything except disorder. Of the lead mines, briefly, of her sister, to whom she should write as often as she pleased at his expense, and a chaise would go to Warwickshire at any hour to bring the child to her, if ever she wished. He asked her what she read. She named Cowper and Miss Burney, and, a little shyly, Catullus in the translation. At that his grave face lightened by a degree she had not yet seen it lighten. "I read him in the Latin. Some evening, if you will let me, I should like to read a line or two aloud to you." And she said, "I should like that, Your Grace," and did not quite know why her heart had quickened. The clock struck 9:30. He rose. "I have kept you long enough. You will be tired. I bid you good night, Miss Ashcombe. You will tell Mrs. Finch in the morning whatever arrangements you prefer. The house, from this hour, is yours." She rose also and curtsied. At the door she paused and turned. "Your Grace, I thank you. For Clara. Above all things, for Clara." He stood with his back to the fire again, his scar silver, his face very still. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "you have thanked me for the one thing I have done which cost me nothing. The rest we shall yet see." She went up by the long gallery, past the painted young officer in scarlet with no scar upon his face, past her own shaking reflection in the black window-panes. Hetty was waiting with a cup of posset. Beatrice let herself be undressed, and brushed and laid in the great bed, and sent the girl away, and then rose again, and put her wrapper about her shoulders, and went to the deep stone embrasure of her window, and sat down upon the cushioned seat there. A thin, clean April moon had risen over the moor, and lay a long, pale road of silver across the heather and the limestone scars away into the dark. The wind sang its single thin note in the gorse below the tower. Somewhere in the stables, a horse stamped once and was still. Ashenmore Hall breathed around her. 2 centuries old, every chimney yet quietly smoking. Beatrice sat with her hands flat upon her knees. She did not move for a long time. She watched the moonlight upon the moor, and listened to the wind in the gorse, and thought of the long scar, and the soldier's bow, and the grave low voice that had said, "The creditors remain paid," and "Your bedchamber has its own lock," and "I shall see it put about in London that the fault was mine." The clock in the gallery struck 12. He is not, she thought, what they said. The morning 2 days after that first interview broke over the moors in a pale saffron light, and Beatrice woke to the sound of a blackbird singing in the ivy outside her casement. The yellow silk hangings moved faintly in the draught. Somewhere below, a dog barked once and was answered. She sat up, pushed the heavy auburn chestnut waves of her hair back from her face, and reached for the shawl at the foot of the bed. She had slept better than she had slept in 3 years. Hetty brought up chocolate and thin toast. She was perhaps 18, with a pink freckled country face and neat brown hair under her cap, and she went about her work with the quietness of a long education in not being observed. "His Grace has ridden out already, miss," Hetty said. "At this hour." "He was gone before 5, miss. To the mines. Mrs. Finch says he will not dine until 8. Beatrice drank her chocolate slowly and looked out at the sweep of park below. The beech avenue, the stone bridge, the pale line of the moor rising beyond. "Hetty," she said, "is there any part of the house I should not go into?" Hetty considered. "No, miss, only His Grace's private study, which is locked. The library is open. The picture gallery is open. The chapel is open. Mrs. Finch said if you should wish to see the still room or the dairy, you are to ring, and she will come herself. Then I shall begin with the library," Beatrice said. The library was not a room. It was a hall, 2 stories high, galleried, with a fluted iron stair spiralling to the upper level and tall, narrow windows that looked out to the moor. The books stood rank on rank in calf and morocco, gilt-stamped, some older than the house itself. There was a great oak table strewn with papers and a Greek dictionary and a half-drunk glass of water. A pair of worn leather slippers stood beneath a wing chair by the cold hearth, as though their owner had stepped out of them an hour before. She took down a volume at random, Herodotus, in the Greek, bound in dark green, and opened it upon the table. In the margin, in a clear, decisive black hand, someone had written a line of commentary, and beneath it, a query, and beneath that, a correction. The ink was brown with age in places and fresh in others. Whoever had read this book had read it 3 times over a period of years and had argued with the text each time. She took down a French Montaigne and found the same hand in French. She took down a duodecimo of Horace and found Latin notes in the same hand, tidier, more schoolboyish. Older, she thought. She stood a long while with the Horace in her hands, looking at the boyish pencil that had once scored a line about friendship, and she thought of the grave, unsmiling man by the fire 2 nights ago, and something in her chest moved and settled. "He reads 3 languages, miss," said Hetty from the door, very softly. "And a little of a 4th, I believe. Mr. Barrow says so." "Who is Mr. Barrow?" "The steward, miss, the one who keeps the mines and the tenants. A very good man. He was His Grace's sergeant in Spain." Beatrice closed the Horace gently and put it back upon its shelf. She walked in the gardens that afternoon. They had been laid out in the last century and half softened by a later hand. A yew walk, a rose garden gone slightly wild, a kitchen garden behind a high brick wall where the bees worked among the lavender and the meadowsweet. She broke off a sprig of meadowsweet and put it into her bodice. The scent was sweet and honeyed and very pale. Beyond the stables, up a white lane between 2 stone walls, stood a squat, slate-roofed building with a brass plate beside its door. "Ashenmore Lead Works," it read, and beneath it, "G. Barrow, Steward." She knocked. A deep voice bade her enter. The office was whitewashed and low-beamed, and it smelt of pipe tobacco and horse leather and the faint iron soot of the lead mine. A man stood at a high desk, with a ledger open before him, perhaps 50, broad and stocky, close-cropped grey hair, a square, honest, sun-browned face with a nose that had been broken once and set poorly. He wore a plain brown wool coat and a buff waistcoat, a white kerchief knotted at his throat rather than a cravat, brown breeches, leather gaiters, and sturdy work boots. His eyes were a steady, clear brown, and they took her in without surprise. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, and made her a bow that was part soldier and part country yeoman. "Mr. Barrow." "I had thought you might come by, ma'am. I did not think it would be so soon. I do not like to be idle." "No, ma'am, I see that." He closed the ledger. "Will you sit?" She sat on the plain wooden chair he offered and folded her hands in her lap. "I should like to understand the estate, Mr. Barrow. I do not propose to meddle, but I should like to understand it." Mr. Barrow looked at her a long moment. Then he said, "It would be my pleasure, ma'am. Where would you wish to begin?" "At the beginning." "The beginning is the lead, Miss Ashcombe. 3 shafts working, 2 stopped, 84 men below, 40 above. A hospital at the pithead with a surgeon from Bakewell twice a week, and a fund, paid from the mine, for the widows and orphans of any man lost below. A school in the village, 6 mornings a week, the master paid from his Grace's pocket. The men are paid weekly in coin, not in truck. No man under 14 goes below. Those are his Grace's rules, ma'am. He sets them and he keeps them. And does he come to the pit himself?" "Every 3rd day, ma'am. He has done so since he came back from Spain." She sat silent a moment. Mr. Barrow's steady brown eyes rested on her without impertinence. At last he said quietly, "There is talk, ma'am, in the county. There has been a great deal of talk this 12 years. I should not like you to think that the talk is the truth." "I do not think it is," she said. Something eased in the steward's broken square face. He gave her the barest nod, a nod she would remember later as the first moment anyone at Ashenmore had looked at her with approval, without having first been instructed to do so. "Come again when you like, ma'am," he said. "The ledger is open to you." The days settled into a pattern. The Duke rose before her and was gone. She breakfasted alone in the little yellow parlour that looked east. She spent her mornings in the library, her afternoons in the garden or the village, her evenings when he was at home, in his grave and courteous company at the long dining table with its 2 candelabra and its 12 empty chairs between them. He dined with her 3 nights out of 7. The other 4, he was at the mines, or at the magistrate's bench at Bakewell, or in a tenant's cottage where a child was ill or a roof had fallen. He was always, when he returned, in charcoal and black, always clean and grave and distant. He spoke of the estate. He spoke of the book she had been reading. He asked after her sister. He did not speak of the war. He did not speak of his scar. He did not ever speak of the woman his servants were said to have feared in Spain. "Your Grace," she said one evening over the soup, and stopped, and did not finish the sentence, and drank the soup instead. His green eyes lifted. "Miss Ashcombe." "It was nothing, Your Grace. I had forgotten what I meant to say." He inclined his head gravely and returned to his plate. But she saw, just once, the smallest quirk at the corner of his grave mouth. The ghost of an understanding, and she dropped her eyes to her bread. She made her inquiries carefully. Mrs. Finch asked about Spain, folded her lips into a line and said, "That is his Grace's business, miss, and not mine to retail." Hetty asked about the scar, whispered that she had heard it was a French sabre and that his Grace had killed the man who gave it him and 4 others besides before the relief came. She had this from the 2nd footman, who had it from the groom, who had it from a soldier in a tavern in Bakewell. Beatrice thanked her and asked no more. In the village she found more. She walked down on a Tuesday to take a parcel of linen to a woman whose husband had been injured in the low gallery a month before. The woman was called Mrs. Trent. She was 40, thin, clean, grateful. She made Beatrice sit by her fire and drink a cup of milk tea, and she said without being asked, "He come himself, ma'am." The day Jem was hurt, he come himself in his dirt from the pit, and he sat on that stool there, and he told me Jem would live, and he put 20 shillings on the mantel, and he sent the surgeon that same hour. He don't hold with talk, ma'am, his grace, but he comes. At the next cottage it was the same, and at the next, a widow whose rent had not been asked of her for 6 years. A farmer whose ploughing ox had died and been replaced within a week. A boy at the school whose copybooks and boots and dinners were paid quietly out of the widow's fund, which was paid quietly out of the Duke. And the Reverend, ma'am, said Mrs. Trent. Every Christmas a new pair of boots. The Reverend is too proud to buy them for himself, bless him. He gives away his stipend and walks in leather that would shame a ploughboy. So His Grace sends a pair up from the bootmaker in Bakewell on Christmas Eve, wrapped in brown paper, no name. Mr. Hartwell pretends he does not know who they are from. We all pretend. His Grace pretends hardest of all. Beatrice set her cup down and looked into the fire a long while. And his first wife? She said at last, very low. Mrs. Trent laughed. A short, surprised laugh. First wife, ma'am. There never was a first wife. There was a poor young Spanish lady whose husband, a colonel of their army, had died in a skirmish, and His Grace found her on the road from Burgos with the French coming behind, and he took her up under his cloak, as one would a lost child, and saw her safe to Lisbon and put her on an English ship to her sister in Portsmouth. A year later in Portsmouth, she took a fever and died, and she wrote him a letter before she died, thanking him. That was all. The letter fell into the hands of a magistrate's wife over in Cheshire who read it out at a dinner party, and by the time it had gone round 3 counties, the poor lady had been His Grace's wife, and had died of fear of him in a locked tower. That is the way of the world, ma'am. Beatrice walked home across the meadow slowly. The meadow-sweet was out in the ditches. The lark was high. She felt a slow, hot shame burning in her chest, not for herself, but for the country that had believed the story, and beneath it, a still gladness she did not yet know what to do with. She wrote to Clara that night. She wrote 2 pages of large, even hand and sealed the letter with a plain wafer. Clara's reply came 4 days later, brought up to her room by Hetty with a pink-flushed face of pleasure on behalf of her mistress. Beatrice broke the seal and read, Dearest B, I am very well, and cook has made a plum cake, and Cedric has not come home for a week, which is a great mercy. I miss you every day and every night. I keep your riband in my prayer book. Miss Lucy says my spelling is improving. I love you always. Your Clara. Beatrice read it 3 times. Then she put it beneath her pillow and sat a long while at her window, with her hands in her lap, and did not cry. A letter came also for the Duke that week, in a round clerical hand, and at dinner that evening he said, Miss Ashcombe, I have a friend who will dine with us on Friday, if you permit. Thomas Hartwell, the vicar at Ashendale. I have known him since we were boys at Eton. He is the best man I know. I should be very glad to meet him, Your Grace. Thank you, he said, and again, just for the smallest part of a second, his grave mouth almost moved. Friday came. Reverend Thomas Hartwell arrived in the late afternoon on a stout grey cob and was shown straight into the library. Beatrice, passing along the gallery, heard from behind the library door a sound she had not yet heard in that house. Her husband-to-be's voice, unguarded, warm, shaking with something very close to laughter. She stopped on the gallery with her hand upon the banister. She listened for a heartbeat. Then, ashamed of listening, she went on. At dinner, Hartwell sat on her right hand. He was 34, with short, sandy brown hair, warm, friendly grey eyes, a slight sunburn across the bridge of his nose, a kind square face with a ready, easy smile, a plain black clerical coat, a white collar band, a small silver crucifix on a black cord at his throat. He shook her hand at the introduction, as though she were an old acquaintance he was pleased to see again. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "I have been wishing to meet you these 3 weeks. He has been unconscionable in keeping you to himself." "Thomas," said the Duke. "You know it is true," said Hartwell equably, unfolding his napkin. "He has not brought you down to the vicarage because he is afraid my cook will give you a cold mutton. You must come nevertheless. Mrs. Plum does a cold mutton of genuine character." Beatrice smiled. Hartwell turned to the Duke. "Alexander, you are glowering. Stop glowering. You will frighten the lady." "I do not glower." "You glower habitually. Miss Ashcombe, does he not glower?" "He looks serious," Beatrice said carefully. "Serious," said Hartwell. "That is the polite word for it. I tell him he must practice before the looking-glass in the mornings. A slight upward curve, so at the corner of the mouth. Not too much. Just enough to indicate that one has not, at breakfast, swallowed a bee." And Beatrice laughed. It was not the small, obedient smile of 9 years at Ashcombe Priory. It was a real laugh, bright, surprised, a little breathless. And it came out of her before she knew it was coming, and she put up her hand to cover her mouth, and the laugh came round her fingers anyway. She dropped her hand, still laughing, and looked across the table, meaning to say something apologetic to the Duke, and her laughter went out of her like a candle. He was looking at her. He was not glowering. His grave mouth had not moved, his long, scarred face had not changed, but in his deep, emerald-green eyes, across the length of the great polished mahogany table, between the 2 branched candelabra and the silver and the white roses, was a look she had never in her 20 years seen on any man's face. It was not hunger, not quite. It was not reverence, not quite. It was something older and simpler than either. He was looking at her. She understood with a slow, soft shock beneath her breastbone, the way a thirsty man looks at a cup of water that has been offered him, and he cannot yet believe is his to drink. She lowered her eyes to her plate. Her heart beat twice, very hard, against her ribs. Reverend Hartwell, a merciful man, had already turned to the Duke and begun upon some story about a parish sexton and a donkey, and the moment closed, and the dinner went on, and no one, not Hartwell, not the footmen, not the grave, distant, courteous, scarred master of the house, spoke of what had just passed between them. But Beatrice, eating her trout without tasting it, knew. And Alexander Drayton, Duke of Ashenmore, lifting his glass to his friend's toast, knew also that she knew. And that knowledge went between them all the rest of the evening, like a fine invisible thread, drawn very taut. That night, she could not sleep. She lay an hour, 2 hours, listening to the house settle, and the owls call over the moor, and the tall clock strike midnight and 1 and 2. At last she rose, put on her dressing gown, took up her candle, and went down to the library. She did not know, until she reached the door, that it was not empty. There was no lamp lit, only the fire, dying low upon the hearth in a bed of rose-red embers, and in the great wing-chair before the fire, he was asleep. He was in his shirt-sleeves. He had taken off his coat and his black silk cravat, and hung them over the arm of the chair. His throat was bare above his open shirt. His dark head was turned a little to one side against the wing. On his broad chest, open and face down, lay a small leather duodecimo, cat veli carmina in gilt. One long tanned hand lay across it, as though he had been holding his place when he fell asleep. His booted feet were stretched to the fender. The firelight did a strange, gentle thing to him. It softened the grave line of his mouth. It took 10 years from his face. It caught in the silver at his temples and laid a pale gleam along the long scar that ran from temple to jaw hinge, turned it, for that one moment, to a line of silver rather than the pale lightning it was by day. He looked, asleep with the book of love poems on his chest, not like the Black Lion of Salamanca. He looked like a tired man who had sat up late reading. Beatrice stood in the doorway with her candle shielded in her hand, and she looked at him a long moment. She did not wake him. She did not cross to him and speak his name. She did not, though something in her hand wished to, lay her fingers along that silver line upon his cheek. She only stood. The fire murmured in the grate. Somewhere above, a beam creaked as old houses creak at 3 a.m. The book rose and fell gently on his breathing chest. After a long while, she moved very quietly across the carpet. There was a cream wool shawl laid over the back of a reading chair by the far window. One of her own, left there that afternoon. She took it up. She came back to him soundlessly upon the thick Turkey rug. She shook out the shawl, and bending a little, laid it across him from shoulder to knee. He did not stir. His breathing did not change. A single dark lock of hair had fallen across his brow. She did not touch it. She straightened. She stood a heartbeat more, looking down at him in the firelight, at the silver scar and the open shirt and the small Latin book rising and falling upon his chest. Then she went out of the library and shut the door behind her without a sound, and carried her candle back through the sleeping house to her own room, and got into her bed, and at last slept. In the morning, when Hetty drew the curtains and Beatrice sat up and reached for her chocolate, she saw that something had been laid upon the cushion of the window seat where she sat each morning to read her sister's letters. It was the cream wool shawl. It had been folded, neatly, precisely a soldier's fold, and tucked between its folds, laid so that she would find it at once when she opened them, was a single pale spray of early meadowsweet, pressed flat, its tiny creamy blossoms still sweet-smelling and perfect from the kitchen garden wall. She sat with the shawl across her knees and the flower in her palm a long time that morning. The blackbirds sang in the ivy outside her casement. Somewhere below, a dog barked once and was answered. And Beatrice Ashcombe, who had not wept at the window on the night her brother pawned her, and had not wept at the window her first night at Ashenmore, and had not wept at any window in 9 hard surviving years, closed her hand very gently upon the meadowsweet, and lowered her face into the shawl. And, for no reason that she could yet put into words, and for every reason in the world, she wept. 3 weeks passed, and in that time the meadowsweet kept its place between the leaves of Beatrice's small travelling Bible, pressed flat and fragrant, and the shawl she had laid over the sleeping Duke was returned each evening to the back of its chair in the library, and each morning borrowed again for her own shoulders, without a word spoken on either side concerning the matter. A habit had grown up between them that neither would have named aloud. She read in the seat by the south window. He read in the wing chair by the fire, and at 10:30, each evening, he would rise, bow, and bid her good night in a voice that had lost, week by week, a little of its careful military chill. Some nights he read to her a line of Catullus. Some nights she read to him a line of Cowper. Neither of them used the word happiness, for it was too large a word for rooms so quiet. But something very like it had taken up residence beneath the rafters of Ashenmore Hall. It ended on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of April, when a post-chaise no one had expected rolled down the long lime avenue at a smart clip and drew up before the great stone steps. Mrs. Finch, who happened to be crossing the hall at that moment with a basket of linens, set the basket down upon the oak coffer so slowly and with so much deliberation that Hetty, coming through from the still room, thought for an instant that the old housekeeper was ill. "Who is it, ma'am?" said Hetty. "It is no one we wanted," said Mrs. Finch. The visitor descended from the chaise and stood a moment upon the gravel, drawing off his gloves, finger by finger. He was a man of 32, neatly built and of average tall height, with golden blonde hair combed fashionably forward in the tightest crop, shallow cornflower blue eyes, fair, smooth, unweathered skin, and a conventionally handsome, narrow face that was spoiled only by a cruel, thin-lipped smile. He wore a bright scarlet military dress coat with gold braid and epaulets, a buff waistcoat, a white cravat tied in the mathematical, white breeches, and polished military boots with silver spurs that chimed softly as he mounted the steps. He glanced up at the Jacobean stone, the ivy, the smoking chimneys, and the cruel little smile deepened. "Lord Percival Vane," he said to the footman, handing in his card. "I am an old brother officer of His Grace. I am passing through the country on my way north, and I could not forgive myself if I did not stop and offer my respects to the Duke's new bride." The footman took the card on a salver and carried it into the library. Alexander, at the writing desk beneath the oriel window, read the card once, laid it down with great care, and said nothing for a full half-minute. Then he said, without looking up, "Tell him I shall be with him directly. Show him into the small drawing-room." The interview that followed was conducted in a tone of such glacial civility that Mrs. Finch, listening shamelessly at the pantry hatch, could have wept for it. The Duke did not sit. Lord Vane did. The Duke did not offer refreshment. Lord Vane remarked upon the fine weather, upon the charming aspect of the avenue, upon the rumour of a new bride which he had had, upon his honour, only from the London papers, and upon his ardent desire, as a man who had once stood beside the Duke in a ditch outside Salamanca, to pay the lady his compliments. Alexander heard him out in silence. When Vane had done, the Duke said only, "You will find the village inn tolerable. The hall is not prepared to receive you." "My dear Ashenmore," said Lord Vane, smiling his thin-lipped smile, "I should not dream of imposing. The inn will answer perfectly. I had hoped only to present myself to the Duchess-to-be." "Miss Ashcombe is at her letters," said Alexander. "She will receive you at breakfast tomorrow, if she wishes." "Then I shall come to breakfast," said Lord Vane, and bowed, and was gone. Mrs. Finch, back in her pantry, said to the scullery maid in a voice like pressed iron, "Put the silver away. Put the second best out. That man does not eat off the ducal plate while I stand in this house." And she did not. Beatrice received Lord Vane next morning in the breakfast parlour, in a simple gown of pale primrose muslin, her auburn chestnut hair drawn back into a loose knot at her nape with a cream ribbon, her mother's silver cross at her throat. He rose as she entered, made her a soldier's bow of very elegant execution, and kissed the air above her fingers. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "forgive the intrusion of an old comrade. I could not pass within 20 miles of Ashenmore without offering my most heartfelt felicitations to the lady who has achieved what half of England had given up for impossible." "You are very kind, Lord Vane," she said. "I am only truthful. Ashenmore, I beg your pardon, His Grace, is the finest officer with whom I ever served. I owe him my life as a matter of plain fact. At Salamanca, when we took the redoubt," and he was away, with a glass of claret in his hand, although it was not yet 10, and a plate of cold ham at his elbow, and the morning sun striking a hard gleam off the gold braid upon his scarlet sleeve. He told the tale of the redoubt. He told the tale of the march from Burgos. He told the tale of a bivouac in the Sierra, at which, he said, the Duke had struck down a Spanish muleteer with the flat of his sabre for stealing an apple. "A hard man," said Lord Vane, chewing. "A hard, hard man. Necessary in war, of course. The 32nd would have broken twice without him. One does not rise to such work by being soft, but one pays a price, afterwards, for the hardness. One does not always set it down again at the door. Beatrice said, "Will you take more coffee, my lord?" He stayed to the end of breakfast. He came again the next morning, and the next, and the next. The footman came to dread the chime of spurs upon the stone of the south portico at 9:15. Mrs. Finch, at the sideboard, counted the covers of the breakfast silver each evening after he had gone, as though she did not quite trust his pockets. Hetty, who had adored Lord Vane on sight and been instantly disabused by a remark she overheard from the pantry, now carried the coffee-pot to table with a small hard set to her chin that she had learnt, without knowing it, from her mistress. Alexander each morning was at the sideboard before either of them, ate in silence, and excused himself to the mines or the magistracy. He said nothing to Beatrice concerning the visitor. He said nothing to Mrs. Finch. He walked through the house each evening with the same quiet tread as before, and at 10:30 he rose from the wing-chair in the library and bowed and bade her good night. But the catullus stayed shut upon his knee, and his eyes, when they met hers across the hearth, were as guarded as they had been on the first night she had come to Ashenmore. Lord Vane, across the breakfast china and the silver coffee-pot, grew daily more charming and daily more specific. He spoke, laughing, of the unfortunate Spanish business, how the Duke had brought a certain young widow down from the Bidassoa, and how odd it was it not, that the poor creature had not survived the year, and how some people in Lisbon had gone so far as to whisper. But one did not listen to such whispers, of course. One knew one's friends. One made allowances. "You know, Miss Ashcombe," he said on the third morning, setting down his cup, "I would not, for the world, have you take alarm. I speak only because you are young and sheltered. Forgive me, and a man of Ashenmore's sort is not easily read by a gentle hand. He has been seen, over the years, to be unaccountable, wild at times, silent at times. I will not say violent. I will say only that the household of his first marriage feared him, and that the young widow is thought, in certain circles, to have died of something other than typhus. I say this as his friend. You understand. I say this because one cannot have a creature so delicate as yourself go unprepared into such a house." Beatrice set down her coffee cup. The porcelain made a small, clear noise against the saucer. She said, "You are very good, Lord Vane." And she went up to her rooms, and she stood at the window looking out over the yew walk, and for the first time in 3 weeks she did not know what she believed. She was 20 years old. She had been reared at Ashcombe Priory with a cook for companion and a drunken brother for guardian. She had crossed the county of Derbyshire once in her life, 3 months before, to come to this house. She had been told one story of the Duke by half the servants in the village, and another story by the tenant wives, and a third story now by a golden-haired brother officer in a scarlet coat. And she looked down into the library from the gallery that afternoon, and saw the Duke at his desk, his head bent over a letter, his scarred cheek in shadow, his hand still, and she could not read in that grave, unreadable face which of the 2 men had given her the truth. She kept to her rooms that evening. She kept to them the next. She came down to dinner on the 3rd day, and ate in silence and lifted her eyes to the Duke's face only once, and could not hold them there, and looked away. Alexander did not press her. He did not ask. He only answered when she spoke, and did not speak himself, and withdrew at 9:30 to the library, and closed the door. On the morning of the 4th day, Lord Vane proposed to her that she should take a turn with him in the yew walk, as the morning was very fine. The yew walk ran from the south terrace, down through a long avenue of dark, clipped yews to a stone bench at the end, where the moor began. It was a cold green corridor, even in April, and very still. Their footsteps made no sound on the old moss. She walked with her hands clasped before her, He walked with his sabre hilt catching, now and then, against his scarlet skirt. Halfway down the walk he stopped, and turned, and took her hand. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "I cannot bear it. I cannot go away on Friday and leave you in this house. My lord, hear me. I beg you, hear me. I am at the Red Lion until Friday. My carriage is sound, my man is discreet. I can have you at your sister's door in Warwickshire by Saturday evening, and no whisper of it heard in London for a fortnight, and by then the thing will be done and unmendable, and you shall be free. There is no shame at all, upon my honour as an officer, in a young lady having mistaken her own nature and found, on closer acquaintance, that she is unequal to such a husband, such a man, such a house. You are a flower, Miss Ashcombe. One does not plant a flower in a quarry." He pressed her hand to his mouth. His lips were hot. She felt the small, hard bite of his teeth behind them. She pulled her hand free so sharply that she tore the lace of her mitt. "Lord Vane," she said, and her voice shook, and she was ashamed that it shook. "You will not speak to me so again. Not in this walk, not at this house, not anywhere." "Miss Ashcombe!" She did not wait. She turned and went back down the walk at a pace that was not quite running, her primrose muslin snapping at her ankles, her hand pressed against the torn lace, and she did not look behind her. At the top of the walk, she did not go into the house. She went round it, across the lawn, through the kitchen yard, round to the stone arch of the stable yard, and there she found him. He was standing at the head of his black gelding, the long rein looped once about his gloved hand, while Mr. Barrow and the farrier bent over the near fore. The farrier had the shoe off, the hoof was being pared. Alexander's coat was hung over the mounting block, and he stood in his shirt-sleeves and his charcoal waistcoat, his jet-black, silver-temple hair ruffled by the little April wind, his scar very pale in the clean morning light. He was speaking quietly to the horse, his free hand laid flat along the glossy neck. He looked up as she came under the arch, and saw her face, and grew perfectly still. "Miss Ashcombe." "Your Grace," she said, "Lord Vane has just, in the yew walk, taken my hand and offered to convey me to my sister in Warwickshire in his own carriage, and rescue me from my marriage, and he pressed my hand to his mouth. I pulled away. I came directly to you. I thought you should know." Mr. Barrow straightened up slowly from the horse's hoof. The farrier paused with his rasp halfway lifted. The black gelding blew out a long breath and shifted its weight. Alexander's face did not change, not by a degree. The deep-set emerald-green eyes did not widen. The scarred cheek did not stir. The grave mouth did not tighten. Only his gloved hand upon the bridle closed. The good leather creaked once in the quiet yard. He said, very quietly, "Thank you, Miss Ashcombe. Please go to the house. Mr. Barrow and I will deal with Lord Vane." She went. She did not see what followed. She only heard an hour later the sound of a horse being led round from the inn stable, and another horse for Lord Vane's manservant, and a trunk being carried down to the yard. And she heard, through the library door as she passed along the gallery, her own husband's voice, level, unhurried, quieter than she had ever heard it, say something of which she caught only the ends of sentences. "Not again. The Horse Guards. Your brother. You will sign. You will not speak of this house, or of Miss Ashcombe, or of any person within it. Ever. You may go." There was no answer audible through the thick oak. There was no crash, no cry, no scraped chair. Only presently the opening and closing of a door, and boots crossing the hall, and the soft chime of spurs down the stone steps, and the sound of hooves on gravel going away under the limes. Alexander did not come to luncheon. He did not come to tea. Beatrice learnt afterwards, piecemeal and over the course of weeks, that he had sat down that afternoon at the writing desk in the library and had written, in his own hand, 3 letters. One went to the Adjutant General at the Horse Guards. One went to the Earl of Vane at his place in Northumberland. One went to the Duke's Club in St. James's. Each letter was short. Each contained a single sentence of fact concerning what Lord Percival Vane had attempted in the Yew Walk at Ashenmore. Each was signed Ashenmore plainly, without adornment or phrase. Within a month, Lord Percival Vane had sold his commission in the Guards, retired to a small property in Dorset that had come to him from a maiden aunt, and was seen no more at Almack's, nor at White's, nor at any public rout or private ball between Grosvenor Square and Green Park. He lived out his days in the country, and nobody in London inquired after him, and nobody in London invited him, and the thing was done. That evening, at 9:15, Beatrice was sitting in the small blue sitting-room that had been made hers, in a soft white wool shawl over a plain grey evening gown, with her tortoise-shell needlework box beside her and nothing in her hands, when a knock came at the door. It was so quiet a knock that for a moment she thought she had imagined it. "Come in," she said. The Duke came in. He had changed for dinner, though he had not come down to it. He wore his charcoal tailcoat of severe military cut, his black silk cravat in its plain, simple knot, his black brocade waistcoat. The candle on the table between them caught the silver at his temples and the long, pale line of his scar. He stood just within the door, and he did not sit. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "forgive me. I shall not keep you long. I came to ask you one question, and I shall be satisfied with any answer you are willing to give." "Yes, Your Grace. I should like to know," he said, "whether you have believed any of what Lord Vane has said to you in this house." She looked at him. The candle trembled a little. She said, simply for she had rehearsed no answer, and wished to give him none but the true one, "For 3 days, Your Grace. I did not know what to believe. I was ashamed of it. I am ashamed of it now. I had been told so many things by so many voices, and I had known you so short a while, and Lord Vane was very fluent. For 3 days I did not know." He did not move. He was watching her as a man watches a sentence being written that will decide his fate. "But tonight," she said, "when I had gone to the stable yard and spoken to you, and you had stood at the head of the horse with the bridle in your hand, and you had not altered your face, and you had said what you said, in the voice you said it in, I knew." He closed his eyes. He stood so a long moment, with his eyes closed, and his hand at his side, open and then slowly closing upon nothing, as if he were steadying himself against a rail she could not see. When he opened them again, they were darker than she had seen them, and very direct and fixed upon her face, and the candle between them was burning quite straight. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "I have been alone for a very long time, longer than I knew, until these last weeks. I will not pretend that I am able to offer you the husband I was meant to be. That man was buried, by a good deal of what has happened a good many years ago. I do not know what is left of him, and I will not promise you what I cannot deliver. But I can offer you this house, and every good thing in it, and the protection of my name, and the whole of my estate, and whatever of myself is left when the day's work is done. I know that it is not what, at 20, you would have chosen. I know you would have chosen otherwise, had the choosing been yours." He did not finish. Or he had finished. She was not certain. She did not wait to see. She rose. The shawl slid from her shoulders to the seat behind her. She did not stop for it. She crossed the small room to where he stood, and she looked up into his grave-scarred face, and she lifted her hand, her small unringed hand that trembled a little, though she wished it would not, and she laid her fingertips very lightly along the pale line of his scar, from the hinge of his jaw up the high cheekbone to the left temple where it began. "It is more than I have been offered in my life, Your Grace," she said. He did not move. He scarcely breathed. His eyes, when she met them, were wet. He did not blink it away, and he did not look aside. Under her fingertips the old scar was smooth and cool, a silver pale seam in the warm brown of his cheek, and she could feel very faintly the steady, hard pulse of him at the jaw. The candle between them burned quite straight, and did not gutter, and they stood so, in the small blue sitting room, for a long time, with no one in the world to see them but the flame. Spring slipped into early summer by so gentle a hand that no one at Ashenmore quite marked the day of its passing. The hawthorn along the lower lane dropped its petals in a single warm evening, and by the following morning the meadows beyond the trout stream were thick with moon daisies nodding in the wind. The bees worked the lavender beneath the library window from first light till dusk, and Beatrice Ashcombe, walking alone one morning along the yew walk with a letter of Clara's open in her hand, understood at last that the 6 months the Duke had offered her had come and gone, and that she had not changed her mind. She had told him so in the simplest fashion she knew. She had put her hand on his at breakfast beside the silver coffee pot and said, "Your Grace, the 6 months are finished, and I remain." And Alexander Drayton had looked down at her small hand upon his scarred knuckles a long while, and had said at last, "Then, with your permission, Miss Ashcombe, I shall ride to Warwickshire on Monday and bring your sister home myself." "You need not go yourself," she said. "Mr. Barrow would." "I should like to go myself," he said. She had not argued. He was gone 4 days. Mrs. Finch ran the house in his absence with her customary gimlet thoroughness and a softness of the eyes she permitted no one to remark upon. Reverend Hartwell came once to dinner and sat late with Beatrice in the library, talking of nothing in particular, for he understood, being a man who had listened to women for 10 years in small parishes, that Beatrice did not so much require conversation as the patient presence of a friend. On the 4th afternoon, as the shadows were lengthening across the south terrace, the sound of wheels came up the drive, and Beatrice was out on the steps with her shawl only half about her shoulders before Mrs. Finch had reached the hall. The chaise was dusty to the axles, and beside the Duke on the box, wrapped in a travelling cloak too big for her and laughing outright at something he had just said, sat Clara, with her long auburn curls in wild disorder beneath the ribbon, her freckled nose already pinkened by 4 days of sun, her white muslin day dress crumpled beyond remedy, and the faded blue sash knotted like a schoolboy's around her waist. She saw Beatrice on the step. She gave one small cry of joy, and before the horses had well halted, she had scrambled down and flung herself upon her sister with such force that Beatrice staggered 2 paces back against the stone balustrade. "Oh, Bee, he let me hold the reins, and we slept one night in a proper inn with a great 4-poster, and he would not let the landlord cheat us over the oats." "Hush, dearest, hush," Beatrice said, laughing into her sister's hair. "You will tell me every word of it, only let me look at you." She held Clara off by the shoulders. Hazel green eyes met hazel green eyes. The child was thinner than she had been in autumn, but she was, plainly and past all arguing, happy. Alexander came down from the box stiffly. The long drive had told upon his right leg. He did not mention it. He stood a moment watching the 2 sisters, and Beatrice, looking up, saw the grave, unreadable set of his mouth, and knew, with the intuition that had grown up in her through these 6 months, that he had brought her more than her sister from Warwickshire. He had brought her news. "You are weary, Your Grace," she said. Come into the house. Mrs. Finch will see to Miss Clara, he said. I should like, when she has had her supper, to speak with you in the library. Clara was carried off by Mrs. Finch, with a great fuss over bread and butter and the question of a hot bath. Beatrice went up to change her dress. When she came down, candles had been lit along the gallery, and a small fire had been put into the library grate against the cool of the evening, and Alexander was standing before it with his hands behind his back. He turned when she came in. He did not smile. "Sit down, Beatrice," he said. She sat. She was surprised to find that her hands in her lap were perfectly steady. "Your brother," he said, "has made what I believe will be his last mistake." "Tell me," she said. He told her without hurry, without ornament, in the plain short sentences he had used all the years of his command. Cedric had gambled away, in the space of 4 months, the £8,000 Alexander had laid upon the table at Ashcombe Priory. Gone at Crockford's, gone at Watier's, gone upon a horse at Newmarket that had not run, gone in a night, at hazard at a house in Jermyn Street. When that was gone, he had taken a quill and forged Beatrice's signature upon a note of hand for a further £3,000, reckoning, correctly, that no creditor would examine the hand of a young lady he had never met. When that began to grow difficult, he had offered Ashcombe Priory itself to a speculator from the city who was casting about for cheap country property. And this speculator, Alexander said, as the good fortune of the world sometimes provides, was a gentleman lately of Reverend Hartwell's acquaintance, a merchant of scrupulous honesty. He brought the matter to Hartwell. Hartwell brought it to me. "When?" Beatrice said. 10 days ago. I would have told you sooner. I wished first to act." "And you have acted." "I have," he said. She waited. "I have bought Ashcombe Priory myself," he said, "from the creditors, at the price they would have accepted from the speculator. The estate is now mine. It will, in the course of time, settle upon Clara as a dowry when she marries. I have put the forged note into my own strong-box. It is not declared, and it will not be published. No court of law will ever see it. And your brother—" He paused. "Your brother is on a ship." "A ship," she said. "The Maria Louisa, out of Bristol. She sailed on Wednesday last for Bridgetown in Barbados. He went aboard her of his own accord, with 1 trunk and a letter of introduction to a planter of my acquaintance. He will receive a remittance of £100 a year, quarterly, so long as he never sets foot upon English soil again. If he does so, the remittance ceases, and the forged note leaves my strong-box. I made this plain to him. He understood me. He agreed," she said. "He had no other course. He knew it. It is, I believe, the first honest calculation he has made in 3 years." Beatrice sat very still. The fire hissed upon a small green piece of apple wood. Somewhere above stairs Clara was laughing at something Mrs. Finch had said. "And what," she said, "will become of him there?" Alexander did not answer at once. When he did, he spoke with a soldier's delicacy, which is to say, he spoke the truth and did not dress it up. "He will drink," he said. "He will drink in Bridgetown as he drank in London, only without the friends to pull him out of ditches. The planter has been instructed to treat him with civility and to refuse him credit. I do not expect, Beatrice, that he will live very long. I am sorry. I should not have undertaken this if I had seen any other way to keep him from ruining you and Clara a second time over." She nodded once. "I understand," she said. And then, to her own surprise, she found that she could not speak for a moment. He did not press her. He did not move. He only stood before the fire, hands behind his back, and waited. "It is strange," she said at last. "I thought I should weep for him. I find I cannot." I have wept for Cedric a great deal in 9 years. I have wept over his debts, and his lies, and his cruelty to Clara, and the dreadful things he said of our mother in his cups. I have wept myself raw for him. I have none left. No, he said, I do not think you have. But my father, she said, and her voice broke upon the word. My father and my mother. She could not go on. Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides. He did not ask, he did not hesitate. He sat down beside her on the library settle, and he drew her against his chest, and he put one large hand flat between her shoulder blades and the other at the back of her head, and he held her there while she wept. Wept properly at last, for her father dead of the fever in the summer of her 12th year, and for her mother gone 6 months after him of what the physicians called a decline, and what Beatrice had always known was simple grief, and for the 9 years she had spent since then running a household, and managing a brother, and raising a little sister, and never once sitting down in any corner of any house to lay her head against another human creature and cry. He did not shush her. He did not tell her it was over. He only held her. She felt the slow, steady beat of his heart against her cheek through the black brocade waistcoat, and she understood, with the clarity that comes only at the bottom of a long weeping, that she had never in her 20 years been held by anyone at all, not by her father, who had been a dignified and distant man, not by her mother, whose illness had taken her into herself, not by Cedric, who was incapable of it. She had held Clara. She had not been held. And now she was. When at last she was still, she did not move away. He did not move her. I beg your pardon, Your Grace, she said into his waistcoat. Alexander, he said. Alexander. There is nothing to beg pardon for, he said. You have been 9 years late to this, Beatrice. Take your time. She smiled, a small watery smile against the black cloth, and she took her time. Meanwhile, in shabby rooms in Half Moon Street in London, Lord Percival Vane, having sold his commission at a loss and been cut by 2 of his clubs, had determined upon one last blow against the man who had, in his estimation, ruined him. He could not challenge the Duke of Ashenmore. He could not go to Derbyshire. What Vane could do, what any gentleman of sufficient malice and insufficient honour could do, was right. He wrote an anonymous paragraph for a minor London scandal sheet called The Tatler's Mirror, a sly piece hinting that the Duke of Ashenmore, lately of a sinister reputation for the disposal of inconvenient wives, had purchased his new bride outright from a spendthrift brother for £8,000, and that the young lady, being now shut up at Ashenmore Hall, was properly to be termed not a wife, but a debt-slave. The piece was unsigned. By the following Tuesday, it had been lifted into the Leicester Journal, the Lincolnshire Chronicle, and the Derbyshire Mercury. Alexander did not read the Derbyshire Mercury. He had not read a scandal sheet in 12 years. Mrs. Finch, however, took it in for the kitchen. She read it on a Saturday morning, at her own small table in the still room, and her sharp brown eyes narrowed, and her mouth set itself into a line that any miner in Derbyshire would have recognised with alarm. She folded the paper in half. She folded it in half again. She carried it into the breakfast room, where Beatrice was pouring coffee from the silver pot into the pale blue and white china cup that had been her morning cup for 6 months, and she laid the paper upon the cloth beside Beatrice's plate without a word, and she went out. Beatrice read it. She read it a second time. She drank her coffee. She ate a slice of bread and butter. She called for pen and ink. "Shall I send for his Grace, miss?" asked Hetty at the door, whose eyes were wide. "No," Beatrice said. "His Grace does not read scandal sheets, and I shall not trouble him. Bring the writing case, if you please." The writing case was brought. Beatrice sat at the small walnut desk in the morning-room window, and she looked a long while out at the meadow full of moon daisies, and she dipped her pen and she wrote. She wrote to the editor of the Derbyshire Mercury. She wrote briefly, cleanly, without self-pity and without apology. She wrote that she was the young lady in question. She wrote that her brother had indeed contracted debts beyond his capacity, that the Duke of Ashenmore had paid those debts upon terms discussed openly, that she had come to Ashenmore of her own free will, having been offered the option to return home at any hour of the first 6 months without prejudice to the settlement, that she had instead remained and was about to be married, and was to the best of her own knowledge the happiest woman in the county of Derbyshire. She wrote that any gentleman who made public insinuation otherwise was a coward. She did not name Lord Percival Vane. She did not need to. She signed her letter Beatrice Ashcombe in her own plain, clear hand, and she gave it to the groom for the post office at Ashendale village. Within 4 days the letter was printed in the Derbyshire Mercury, occupying the entire lower half of the second page under the heading A Letter from a Lady. Within 10 days it had been reprinted in the Morning Post. Within 3 weeks it had been reprinted in the Gentleman's Magazine, with a small editorial note praising its dignity. Within a month, the whole of London knew whose pen had written those 3 paragraphs, and whose name was not written in them, and the drawing-rooms had decided what they decided. In a house in Brook Street, an elderly lady named Lady Crawford, who had for 12 years repeated every unkind rumour about Alexander, laid down her coffee cup and said to her companion, "Well, my dear, I am an old fool, and I have been an old fool a long time. That girl has more sense in her little finger than I have had in my life." She read the letter through again, slowly, and said at the end of it, "Now, we shall see Lord Percival Vane driven to Calais where he belongs." In a club in St. James's, 2 gentlemen over their claret read the reprint aloud to one another and laughed outright at the plain cold sentence about cowards. And at a rout in Grosvenor Square, that evening, when Vane was named by an inattentive hostess, 4 matrons in succession declined to be introduced to him, and a 5th turned her back upon him in the middle of a sentence. By the end of June, he had taken a packet for the Continent. He did not return. Alexander, when at last Reverend Hartwell brought him the Morning Post with the letter in it, Hartwell having ridden over specifically, beaming, read it through in silence twice. He folded the paper. He laid it down upon the library table. He looked at Beatrice, who was sitting across from him with her needlework, and she looked up at him, a little pink about the cheekbones, but perfectly steady in the eye. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "you have fought a cleaner action than I fought at Salamanca." "I had a better cause, your grace," she said. "Alexander," he said. "Alexander." He inclined his head. Hartwell, across the room, had the grace to become suddenly and profoundly absorbed in a volume of sermons. That was the Wednesday. The Sunday following was the last Sunday of June, and the little grey stone church at Ashendale was full, the pews warm with sun, the flowers on the altar freshly cut from the vicarage garden, the smell of old hymn books and fresh-turned hay coming through the open door. Alexander sat in the Ashenmore pew with the carved lion above his head. Beside him sat Beatrice in a pale sprigged muslin and a plain chip-straw bonnet tied with cream ribbon. Beside her, with her small gloved hands folded exactly as she had been taught, sat Clara, whose hazel-green eyes had not left the stained-glass window throughout the sermon. Reverend Hartwell preached upon the parable of the sower. He preached it plainly and short. At the final hymn, the village voices went up through the old rafters with the warm strength of country lungs, and Beatrice, singing, felt Alexander's sleeve brush her own. The congregation filed out into the churchyard. The sun was high. The yew above the lich gate dropped a patch of black shade onto the flagstones, and beyond it, the churchyard grass was white to the knee, with moon daisies and thick red clover and the small yellow stars of hawkweed. The village stood about in its Sunday best. The miners scrubbed clean, their wives in their good bonnets, the farmers in plain dark coats, the children running already for the meadow. Mrs. Hollis, the squire's wife, a stout matron in puce silk with a feathered bonnet, had been observed to leave her pew quickly. She was now crossing the churchyard at a determined pace. Mrs. Hollis, who for 6 months had not once called at Ashenmore Hall, who had once in a shop at Bakewell, turned her head ostentatiously as Beatrice passed. Mrs. Hollis came directly across the grass to Beatrice, her colour rather high, her eyes behind the feathers perfectly honest. "Miss Ashcombe," she said. "Mrs. Hollis," Beatrice said. "My dear," said Mrs. Hollis, "you have my friendship, if you will have it." She put out her gloved hand. Beatrice looked at it a moment. She had, at 20, known a great deal of slight and a great deal of snub, and she had learned, in a hard school, how to receive both with composure. She had not learned, having had no occasion, how to receive an apology from a squire's wife in a country churchyard on a sunlit summer morning. She found, rather to her own surprise, that the tears in her eyes were not bitter ones. She took Mrs. Hollis's hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Hollis," she said. "I shall be very glad to have it." "You must come to tea on Thursday," said Mrs. Hollis, who was, having crossed her Rubicon, now determined to make a thorough business of it. "You and your sister, and His Grace, of course, if he will spare the afternoon." "We shall come," Beatrice said. Mrs. Hollis pressed her hand, inclined her feathered bonnet at Alexander with a deep and entirely genuine curtsy. The first, Alexander reflected with mild astonishment, that he had received from her in his life, and rustled away in her puce silk toward her waiting barouche. Beatrice stood a moment without moving. Alexander said, at her shoulder, very quietly, "Well fought, Miss Ashcombe." "Beatrice," she said. "Beatrice." She smiled. They left the churchyard together. Clara, who had been waiting with great patience under the yew, came running, her auburn curls flying, her white muslin already grass-stained at the hem, and her faded blue sash untied. She seized Beatrice's left hand in both of her own and swung on it. "Bee, may we walk home through the meadow? May we? Mr. Barrow says there is a heron on the stream. We may," Beatrice said, and so they walked. Alexander gave his right arm to Beatrice, and she laid her hand in the crook of it, and Clara held her left hand, and the three of them went out of the lych gate and turned off the lane at the stile, and went down through the long meadow toward Ashenmore Hall. The grass was thick to the calf with moon daisies, and the air was warm with clover and cut hay, and a lark went up somewhere over their heads and sang itself out of sight into the blue. A yellowhammer on a gorse bush repeated its small summer phrase. Far across the field a cuckoo answered from the wood. Beatrice looked down at Clara's bright head and across at Alexander's dark one, bent a little to hear something the child was saying, and out at the shining field of moon daisies. And she thought of the young woman who had stood on the gravel drive of Ashenmore Hall 6 months before, with a marriage contract in her hand, and had believed herself sold, and she thought of the 9 years before, that in which she had not been held, had not been heard, had not been spoken for. And she thought of her mother and her father in the little Warwickshire churchyard, where she had finally been able to weep for them, and she pressed Clara's small hand gently in her own, and tightened her grip upon Alexander's sleeve, and walked on through the summer meadow, toward the grey stone house upon the rise. She had never in her life been so happy. The first Saturday in July came in upon a soft grey dawn that did not last. By 7 the mist had lifted off the moor, and the sun had come out over Ashendale as if ordered, and the bees in the wild rose hedges along the lane to the parish church were already in full industry. The little grey stone church stood on its low mound above the trout stream, with its west door flung open and its bell already ringing, and the whole valley, it seemed, was walking toward it. The lead miners came first, by ancient custom, in their Sunday black, their wives on their arms and their children scrubbed pink. The tenant farmers came next, from the low fields along the river, with bunches of wild roses, great tumbling white and pink handfuls of them, briared and dew-wet, cut that morning out of the hedgerows. The village women came in their best print gowns, and the old men in coats that had not been out of the press since Waterloo. Mrs. Finch walked up the lane in her good black silk, a gown she had not worn since the old Duke's funeral 12 years before. Her grey hair was smoothed beneath a fresh white cap. Her white collar and cuffs were starched past reason. She walked with her hands folded before her, and her mouth set in its firm line. But a woman who knew her well would have observed that the corners of that mouth, this morning, were turned 1/4 of an inch higher than they had been in 10 years. Mrs. Finch was very nearly smiling. Inside, wild roses were bound about every pillar. Sprays of meadowsweet stood in pewter jugs upon the altar. The stone floor had been swept, the brasses polished. Reverend Thomas Hartwell stood in his plain black cassock at the chancel step, his short sandy hair brushed flat, his small silver crucifix at his throat on its black cord. He was a man who smiled easily. This morning he could not keep the smile off his face. Alexander Drayton, Duke of Ashenmore, stood at the chancel step with his hands clasped quietly before him. He wore a plain dark blue coat, cut in the fashion of his old regimental colours, not his uniform, which hung in a press upstairs at the hall, and would hang there until it fell to dust, but a coat made up that spring to the same grave cut. With it, he wore a black waistcoat, a plain white cravat, simply knotted, fitted charcoal trousers, polished black boots, and upon the smallest finger of his right hand, the plain silver mourning band he had worn every day for 7 years, for a friend lost at Salamanca. His jet-black hair, streaked prematurely silver at the temples, had been brushed back from his brow. The long, pale, diagonal scar that ran from his left temple through his cheekbone to the hinge of his jaw caught the light from the east window. He did not move. Only his deep-set emerald eyes betrayed him. They did not leave the west door. Mr. Barrow stood at his right hand as his groomsmen, in a plain brown coat and buff waistcoat and the white kerchief he had knotted at his throat these 30 years. His broken nose was scrubbed. His steady brown eyes were narrowed against the light. The bell ceased. The organ struck up a plain processional. Every head in the church turned. Clara came first. Clara Ashcombe, a slender, lively child with her auburn curls loose down her back and tied with a fresh cream ribbon, her wide hazel-green eyes enormous in her freckled face, her cheeks flushed with the importance of the morning. She wore a new white muslin frock and a cream sash, and carried a small round posy of meadowsweet and lavender bound with silver thread. She had been schooled in her duties by Mrs. Finch the previous afternoon, and she had attended to every word. She did not look to the right or the left. Her small straight back was perfectly straight. At the chancel step she curtsied and stepped aside. Then, and only then, she turned her head and looked at the west door and smiled. Behind her came Beatrice. She walked up the aisle alone. She had no father to give her away, and she had refused every offered proxy. Alexander had suggested Mr. Barrow, and she had thanked him and kissed his cheek and said that she would walk up the aisle on her own 2 feet and be given away by no one but herself. She wore a simple gown of fine ivory silk with a pattern of small embroidered leaves worked in pale green thread about the hem. A short lace veil fell from the crown of her head, pinned with the single strand of small seed pearls that her mother had worn on her own wedding day 29 years before. She wore no jewels, only the tiny silver cross of her mother on its thin black silk cord lay at her throat. Her auburn chestnut hair had been pinned in a loose Grecian coronet, threaded with her mother's tortoiseshell pins. The soft curls at her temples had escaped as they always did. In her hands she carried a small bunch of white moon daisies, gathered at 6 that morning before anyone in the house had stirred. She was 20 years old. She carried herself up the aisle in her plain silk gown and her mother's pearls with such quiet, simple dignity that the miners' wives in the back pews began silently to weep, and Mrs. Finch pressed her lips together hard, and Mr. Barrow's broken nose coloured, and Alexander Drayton closed his eyes for the space of a single breath, and opened them again, and watched her come. She reached the chancel step. She met his eyes. She did not look away. She placed her hand in his. "Dearly beloved," said Reverend Hartwell, "we are gathered together here in the sight of God to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." He spoke of love and of reverence and of fidelity. He came, at last, to the vows. "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" he said to Alexander. "I will," Alexander said. His voice was steady. It was a grave, quiet soldier's voice that did not lift and did not tremble. "Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband?" said Reverend Hartwell to Beatrice. "I will," she said. Her voice was clear. It carried as far as the back of the church, where an old miner pressed his hat against his chest and bowed his head. Reverend Hartwell placed her right hand in Alexander's. Alexander's fingers closed around hers. "I, Alexander Edward Drayton," he said, "take thee, Beatrice Mary Ashcombe, to my wedded wife, to have and to hold." He stopped. It was only a small pause. A man who was not watching closely would have thought it no more than a drawing of breath. But Beatrice felt the fractional tightening of his hand upon hers, and Reverend Hartwell saw Alexander's jaw set, and waited, and did not prompt. Alexander mastered himself. It took him perhaps 2 seconds. "To have and to hold," he said, "from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, and thereto I plight thee my troth." He did not falter again. Beatrice spoke her part after him, without tremor, without hesitation, in the same clear, steady voice with which she had said, "I will." Alexander slid the plain gold ring upon the 4th finger of her left hand. It fitted perfectly. He had taken the measure of her finger himself, in the library, one quiet evening in May. Reverend Hartwell laid his hand upon their joined hands and pronounced them man and wife. Somewhere in the church, a woman made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. It was Mrs. Finch, though no one ever said so. Alexander lifted his wife's veil with the backs of his fingers, very carefully, as a man handles a thing he has waited a long time to touch. He bent his head and kissed her. There in the sight of Reverend Hartwell and Clara and the whole of Ashendale parish, upon the mouth, but briefly and gravely, as befitted the place, and when he drew back, his emerald eyes were wet, and he did not look away. They signed the register with Mr. Barrow and Clara as witnesses, and Clara's small, careful signature, Clara Eliza Ashcombe, written out in a round, determined hand. Then the doors were flung open, and the bell began again, and the Duke and Duchess of Ashenmore walked down the aisle together, out into the high, clear July sun. The whole village was waiting in the churchyard. A shower of wild rose petals came down from rush baskets. The miners raised a ragged 3 cheers. An old tenant farmer pressed into Beatrice's hand a tight bunch of white heather for luck upon the moor. Clara, still clutching her posy, took hold of Beatrice's other hand and did not let it go. "Our Duchess," said an old woman to her neighbour in the soft Derbyshire vowels. "Look at her." "Aye," said the neighbour, wiping her eye. "She'll do." The wedding breakfast was laid in the great dining room at Ashenmore Hall. The long oak table had been polished to a mirror. There was a great baron of beef, and a salmon from the trout stream, and strawberries from the kitchen garden, and a great white wedding cake Mrs. Finch had iced with her own hands. There was champagne and home-brewed ale for the miners at the tables laid upon the south terrace. Reverend Hartwell spoke grace. Mr. Barrow rose at the appointed moment, cleared his throat, and stood at the foot of the table with his broken nose reddened and his steady brown eyes fixed upon a point some 3 feet above the Duke's silver candelabrum. "I am no speaker, Your Grace, ladies and gentlemen," he said. "I am a man who has soldiered. I served under the Duke's father when the Duke here was a lad in a nankeen jacket no taller than that sideboard, and I served beside the Duke himself for 7 years in Spain. I was there, begging your pardon, ma'am, at Salamanca, where the Duke received the mark that some foolish people have been pleased to call a disfigurement, and which is in truth the best piece of tailoring a French sabre ever did upon an English face." There was a murmur of laughter. Alexander looked down at his plate. Beatrice laughed outright, once a clear small sound. "And I will tell you now what I have never told another living soul," said Mr. Barrow, and his voice roughened, and he fixed his eyes at last upon Beatrice. "When he came home, after the war, and shut himself up in this house, and would not have visitors nor any young lady come near him, I thought I had lost him. I thought the country had lost him. I was wrong, ma'am. He was waiting. I did not know what he was waiting for. I know it now. He was waiting for you." He stopped. He coughed. He looked at the ceiling. "I am his man, as my father was his father's man. And I tell you, Your Grace," he turned full upon Beatrice, "there are 3 souls at this table who have loved him all his life, and we are right glad to make room for a 4th. God bless the Duke and Duchess of Ashenmore. May they live long. May they be happy." He sat down very fast. There was a great roar of approval from the lower tables, a stamping of feet, a hammering of knife handles on the boards. Alexander had been blinking hard throughout the last 3 sentences. Beatrice laughed and wept and laughed again, and reached her hand across the cloth to Mr. Barrow, and he, rising half out of his chair, took it and kissed it, the first and the last time in his life that Giles Barrow kissed a lady's hand, and sat down again, very red, staring at his plate. The afternoon wore away. The miners on the terrace sang, an old ballad, then a shepherd's tune, then a hymn the whole company took up. Clara fell asleep in a chair by the window, with her posy still in her lap. Mrs. Finch covered her with a shawl. The guests took their leave. Reverend Hartwell shook Alexander's hand at the great door and did not speak. He did not need to. The miners trooped home up the valley in the gold light, singing still. It was past 10 before the hall was quiet. Alexander came for his wife in the long gallery. He did not speak. He held out his hand. She put her own into it. He led her past the portraits of his dead fathers, past the suit of tilting armour, past the tall case clock, to the oak door at the far end that she had never passed through in all her 8 months at Ashenmore. He opened it. Firelight fell across the threshold. "This," he said, "is my own room. You have not been in it before." "No," she said. He bent. He set one arm beneath her knees and one behind her shoulders, and he lifted her, silk gown and all, as if she weighed nothing, and he carried her across the threshold and set her upon her feet before the hearth. Then he stepped back half a pace and looked at her. It was a great square room, panelled in dark old oak, with a tall canopied bed of the last century, and a writing table before the window. A fire of applewood burned on the hearth. On the mantel stood a single miniature in a plain silver frame, a young officer with dark hair and laughing eyes, who had once been Alexander's closest friend, and who lay now under Spanish earth. A vase of white moon daisies had been set beside it. Beatrice had not put them there. Alexander must have gathered them that morning, before anyone else had risen. "Beatrice," he said. He did not often say her Christian name. He said it now as if he tasted it. "Alexander," she said. He came to her. He laid his hands upon her shoulders. He looked down into her face, and she looked up, and did not flinch, and had never flinched, and would never flinch. "I have waited 3 years," he said, "for a thing I did not think I should have." "I know," she said. "I do not know how to do this. I have been a soldier. I have not been a husband." "Then we shall learn it together," she said. "I have not been a wife." He bent his head. He kissed her, not as he had kissed her in the church, gravely, briefly for the eyes of Ashendale, but properly now, as a man kisses the woman he has waited for, his hand at the nape of her neck, his other hand at her waist, her face lifted to his in the firelight. It was a long kiss, and a grave kiss, and a kiss that had in it all the 3 years he had not been able to speak of, and all the 12 years before that in which he had believed himself unlovable. When at last he lifted his head, her cheek was wet, and she put up her hand and touched, very gently, the wet line of his cheek also, and found it wet too. "There," she said softly, "we are both alive. We are both here." He laid his forehead against hers. They stood so, a long moment, in front of the applewood fire, not speaking. The pearls of her mother gleamed in the loose wave of her hair. The miniature on the mantel looked down at them quietly. The candles burned low. What passed between them in that room belonged to them. And it is enough to say that when the July dawn came in over the moor and the first blackbird began in the copse below the window, the Duke of Ashenmore was, for perhaps the first time since Salamanca, at peace. The summer that followed was the longest and kindest the Peak District had seen in a generation. The hay came in dry. Clara went away in the autumn to a small school for gentlewomen in Buxton, and came home for every holiday with her letters improved and her small determined opinions upon everything. Beatrice learned the household. She sat at the head of her own long table. She visited the cottages. She was called, in time, by every woman in the valley, our Duchess. And they did not mean the title. A year passed. The July sun came round again. The wild roses opened in the hedges. The moon daisies came up thick in the meadow. On a blue afternoon in the formal gardens of Ashenmore, Clara Ashcombe, 13 now and taller by 3 inches, her auburn curls tied back with a green ribbon, sat cross-legged beneath the great cedar with a volume of Miss Edgeworth open on her knee and a fat grey cat asleep beside her. Along the gravel path, the Duke and Duchess of Ashenmore walked together. Alexander wore his shirt sleeves, for the day was warm, his dark blue coat slung across one arm. His left hand was closed over the small hand Beatrice had tucked into the crook of his elbow. She wore a simple gown of pale yellow muslin and a broad-brimmed straw hat tied under her chin. They walked slowly, with the gait of 2 people who had long since stopped being in a hurry to be anywhere but beside each other. At the foot of the south lawn, a little group was gathered. 6 of the Ashenmore lead miners stood with their hats off. Beside them, 2 women in black held the ends of a long green ribbon stitched in gold, the banner of the Lead Miners' Widows' Fund, which Beatrice had founded the previous autumn out of her own pin money. Behind them stood the modest new stone building, slate-roofed, whitewashed inside, which was the new infirmary for the miners and their families, the first in Derbyshire. Mr. Barrow stood at the gate in his brown coat, holding his hat. Mrs. Finch stood beside him in her good black silk, her hands folded, her mouth in its firm line. They only watched as the Duke and Duchess came down the path. Beatrice raised her hand. The two women in black raised the green ribbon. The miners' wives within the infirmary doorway began quite softly to sing the old hymn they had sung on the terrace a year before. The ribbon rose against the blue July sky and was made fast to the iron staple above the door. The little crowd cheered, but gently as Derbyshire people cheer. Beatrice looked up at her husband. He was not looking at the ribbon. He was looking at her. "Your Grace," she said. "My love," he said. Mr. Barrow at the gate turned his face a little aside, as he sometimes did these days, and Mrs. Finch beside him did not remark upon it, as she never did. The evening came down, soft and gold. Clara had been called in at last from her cedar tree for her supper. The servants moved through the rooms lighting the candles. The long shadows of the yew walk stretched eastward across the lawn. Below the yew walk stood an old stone bench, weathered smooth by 200 summers. From it, one looked southward across the ha-ha and out over the open moor, rising toward the high ridge where the lead workings lay, purpling now in the last of the sun. Alexander and Beatrice sat upon the bench together. He had a small, worn volume of Catullus open on his knee, the same volume which had lain upon his chest in the library chair upon the night she had first covered him with a shawl. He was reading aloud to her, quietly, translating as he went, a poem about 2 lovers and sparrows and 1,000 kisses and 1,000 more. She had her head against his shoulder. Her hand lay in his. He finished the verse. He did not turn the page. He looked out across the darkening moor, where the first star was showing over the ridge, and he was silent a long moment. "I was told, all my life," he said at last, "that I was a man no woman would choose." Beatrice turned her head slowly upon his shoulder. She looked up at him, at the long pale scar, at the jet-black hair greying at the temples, at the grave emerald eyes that had not yet learned, quite, to believe their good fortune. "Then they did not know the half of you," she said. "They never looked." He did not answer. He did not need to. He bent his head and laid his cheek a moment against her hair, and they sat on together in the gathering dusk, while the bees went home out of the yew walk, and the first owl called from the copse, and the great summer stars came out one by one above the moor of Ashenmoor. Beatrice Ashcombe had not, in the end, been a rescuer, and Alexander Drayton had not been a monster. The world had drawn a picture of each of them and had called it the truth, and neither of them had been free until they had looked into the other's face without the world's picture in the way. What she had seen in him, in the firelight of that first library, the grave green eyes, the steady soldier's hands, the loneliness that had waited 12 years for a door to open, was only what had always been there, and what no one else in all that time had troubled to see. She had looked. That had been enough. It had, in truth, been everything.